When we think about history, we often think of grand events and major figures. But sometimes the most powerful understanding comes from the story of a single family. By looking at the records they left behind, things like census data, old newspaper clippings, and family accounts, we can piece together the story of the McDermott family of Westfield, Massachusetts. It's a story of immigrant hope, sudden tragedy, and the often harsh realities of life in early 20th century America.
This is where our story ends, and in many ways, it's also where it begins. This is the gravestone of Mary Scanlon McDermott. She died when she was just 32 years old. To really understand her life, a life that was cut so tragically short, we have to start with the journey of her husband, Richard McDermott, a young man who crossed an ocean searching for a brand new life.
So let's begin with part one. We're going to trace Richard's path all the way from his home in Ireland to a town called Westfield, Massachusetts, the place where he hoped to build his future.
Richard Francis McDermott was born in Ballyhea, County Cork, Ireland, back in 1886. Now, he might have traveled to America earlier, but he always declared his official immigration date as 1913. That was the year he boarded the RMS Coronia, leaving his home in Ireland behind for a new beginning in the United States.
Once he got to Westfield, Richard really didn't waste any time establishing himself. If you look through the old city directories, you can see a steady climb. In 1906, we see him working at the Pope Manufacturing Company. By 1915, he's landed a position as an assistant steward at the very prestigious Westfield Club. And just a year later, he moves to the Hotel Bismarck, eventually becoming their wine clerk in 1917. This timeline, it shows a man who is clearly on the rise.
Now, the Hotel Bismarck was one of the finest places in Westfield, and the job of wine clerk wasn't just a simple service job. No, it required real knowledge, and it was a position of trust. For an Irish immigrant at that time, a job like this represented significant success and, importantly, stability. By 1916, you could say Richard McDermott had truly arrived.
With his career secure, Richard was ready to start the next chapter of his life. So, part two is all about the family's hopeful beginning, which starts with his marriage to Mary Scanlon.
The local newspaper really captured the optimism of that day. On October 7, 1916, it announced, "A pretty fall wedding took place yesterday morning at 9 o'clock in St. Mary's Church, Westfield, when Miss Mary J. Scanlon and Richard F. McDermott were united in marriage." This was it. This was the start of their life together.
And the details of the wedding, they really speak volumes about their hopes and dreams. You have the bride's elegant gown, the groom's gift of a beautiful gold lavalier, the wedding breakfast hosted at Richard's respected workplace, and a very ambitious honeymoon. This was, by every account, the absolute high point of their lives. After that wonderful honeymoon, the newlyweds came back to Westfield and set up their first home together at 12 White Street, all ready to start their family.
And their family grew, and it grew quickly. In July of 1917, their first son, Richard Francis, was born. He was followed by David Peter in 1919, and then John Joseph in 1920. So in just a little over 3 years, they were a family of 5.
But, during this exact same period of growth, a subtle sign of instability starts to creep into the records. Between 1920 and 1925, the family moved from White Street to Dubois Street, then to Chestnut Street, and finally over to Bates Street. 4 different homes in 5 years. Well, that suggests a life that was becoming a lot less settled.
And this brings us to part 3 of the story, tragedy and turmoil. That hopeful beginning was about to come to a sudden and absolutely devastating end.
The facts here are just stark and heartbreaking. On May 10, 1925, Mary gave birth to their 4th child, a daughter they also named Mary. Just 17 days later, on May 27th, Mary McDermott died from mastoiditis, which is a severe infection. At 32 years old, she was gone, leaving Richard a widower with 3 young sons and a newborn daughter to care for.
Her death was announced right here in the local paper. The notice lists her surviving husband and 4 children. The very foundation of their family had just been shattered, and Richard now faced an unimaginable challenge all on his own. As if this personal tragedy wasn't devastating enough, it was compounded by a major national event. When Prohibition was enacted in 1920, Richard's skilled job as a wine clerk, it vanished. The 1917 City Directory lists his prestigious title, but by 1922 he's listed simply as a laborer. For so many people in that industry, this was a crippling blow. For Richard, it meant his financial stability disappeared right when he and his family needed it the most.
This was the family home at 23 Bates Street, and it was here, in this house, that Mary's funeral was held. A place that once held all the promise of a happy family life became a site of profound sorrow and, really, the beginning of the family's complete unraveling.
The family's decline is illustrated by one particularly painful family story. After Mary's death, their young son John was sent to live with relatives, and he was struck by a car. When an insurance settlement was paid out, Richard reportedly traveled to claim the money for himself, taking John back to Westfield with him. It was a clear act of desperation.
And this leads us to the final, heartbreaking chapter of this story, Part 4, A Family Dissolved.
By May of 1927, the family's private struggles had become a very public matter. This newspaper clipping shows that Richard McDermott was in district court pleading not guilty to a charge of neglecting his children. He was a man who was completely overwhelmed, and now the legal system was involved.
The final moment, as it was passed down in the family history, is just haunting. Richard was living in a hotel with his sons at this point. He told them to get dressed in their Sunday best because he had a special surprise for them. He asked them to wait for him out front, but he never came. He left through the back door and simply disappeared from their lives.
This is the final entry we find in the public record. The 1930 census shows the three McDermott boys, Richard, David, and John, living in a foster home in Woburn under the care of Catholic Charities. You see, despite having a large extended family in the area, they were now wards of the state.
The story of the McDermotts is just one single, tragic thread in the much larger tapestry of the American immigrant experience. Their family's collapse really shines a light on the immense pressures of economic upheaval, personal loss, and the fragile nature of the American dream, a reality that was faced by so many who came to this country hoping for a better life.